happy to be here and so on with you all. I would just begin this way, that I don't think that Sue Lee could have put together a more timely discussion than she has today. Last night, what about 9 p.m., so on, we get the remainder of the report on the tariffs. We knew Brazil was coming a little bit earlier than that and so on. I cannot think of a time in my 60-year career and so on where relationships have been worse than between the US and Brazil. Sometimes perhaps back in the 70s, 80s, and the dictator, maybe, but nothing like that, and certainly nothing with trade. We were always guided by the WTO, or before that, what I always call the General Agreement to Talk and Talk, although other people call it the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, and so on. Brazil was always the most active country in the GATT. You may recall, for those people who go back there, that Itamar in those days, the foreign ministry, used to be in charge of trade negotiations, and they literally were the first Latin American country to really involve themselves in international trade. So what has happened has been that because of a combination of both the Dems and the Republicans, not only Trump, we have pretty well, I want to say, denuded the international organization. This is the U.S. moving ahead saying we're unilaterally going to put on duties. We have destroyed by not allowing appointments to the dispute settlement mechanism. To many of our surprise, and a key development was when the Europeans agreed. A lot of debate in Europe, but when they said, yes, the US, you have the right to unilaterally impose a 15% duty on us without any justification, without any citing any WTO article, just do it, and so on. And we're also going to end up investing in your country. Well, the fact of the matter is that if you're a big market like the US, forget about the trade balance. The Europeans cannot take the battle with the US. Countries divided up. Anyway, they got away with it. When that happened, I thought the game was over. And other countries, of course, have lined up or will line up and so on sign on. What makes Brazil a particularly hard issue to deal with is this political domain. And as I was explaining, and please, John and anyone else, I'm not a Brazilian expert. So anything I say about Brazil incorrect, just feel free to say, I don't know what I'm talking about, and I'll agree with you. But my reading of Mr. Trump, and I am from New York, I'm from Queens. He's from Queens, which is a borough that always had an inferiority complex compared to Manhattan and so on. So we go through that and we kind of react accordingly and so on. But Trump has some basic rules in life. And one is, if you work with me, I'm going to take care of you. If you work against me, I'm going to destroy you. As we would say, I'm going to destroy your eating bowl, which in the Far East used to mean that you're going to starve, and so on, etc. And a lot of his politics are tied to his attempt to show that his support of the former president, he's with him, and his basic goal, very clearly, is to have an ally of Mr. Bolsonaro, if not himself, back in the presidency. And he would like that to happen sooner rather than later and so on. So he's driven by that even more, I think, than he is by trade policy in his relationship with Brazil. How do you deal with that? Well, I'm out of my league. I don't know how you deal with people and their personal vendettas or desire to show that being my friend makes you special. So you have that issue. I don't think, from what I've been reading, that the trade implications as far as damaging the Brazilian economy is that great. First, you now have much larger trade with the European Union, and much larger trade now with China, and so on, etc. So they are sitting there as really more major. Two, they exempted many products, including orange juice, which of course what all of us got nervous about, but we have orange juice in the morning. We don't like to fool around with that. But you have the exemptions that are in place and so on, etc. Three, you're also moving in a whole new group of no world, whether it ever turns into anything else, but this new little protective curtain in the US may make trade with Latin America more important and so on. So my first question would be to anyone else who's on this panel is, how serious is this? Is it going to push you into recession? Or you already have enough internal problems that, it's another little source, but nothing that's going to really change anything? And then two, if it is, what countermeasures can you take if the US still insists on a political condition which may not be acceptable which may not be acceptable for negotiation by the Brazilian government? So let me just stop there and say this is how I'm looking at it, but I think we need a little input from the other side. But my feeling is all bad things will pass. We have a term limitation. We'll see if it's observed. I assume it will be. So we may have a new world 3 years from now. But in the interim, is this problem as serious as people are making it out?
Um, I'm glad that you have this positive outlook, Stephen. In regard to your question about the economic impact of these tariffs on Brazil and Brazilians, I would pass it to the expert, John.
Thank you, Sueli, and I wanted to thank you again for inviting me to participate. Very nice to meet you, Stephen. Maybe we'll see each other sometime in person. You almost answered the question. I can't, especially in terms of Brazil, it's very hard to tell exactly what the objectives are. They look like they're positive, but they're economic. Sometimes they look like they're political. I really can't disentangle them. But however, it's going to have a bad effect on all three. Let's see, we'll take Florida. Our main source now of concentrated orange juice comes from Brazil. That's a long story, that one, especially how trade restrictions, kind of boomerang. Very simply, when they put a tariff on imports of Brazilian oranges to protect Florida orange growers, the Brazilians came up and bought all the orange workers in Florida and then got the subsidies, the implicit subsidy from the protection. Same thing we're seeing with U.S. Steel, by the way, which is, is going to be good for the shareholders and no one else. And it's the overall trade focus of the United States will cause, I think, a recession. Oh, it hasn't happened yet. Well, yeah, it takes a little. If you go back to what happened after the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the 1930s, the whole effects took a whole decade and you had a complete collapse of international trade. Oh, it took a little less than that because they started opening again in the second half of the 30s before World War II. So in terms of Brazil, it's going to hurt. But Brazil is has a very diversified export base. And that's one of the things they've conscientiously done, sometimes for the better, sometimes not so great. They certainly, their biggest trade partner is China. And so they have diverted a lot of stuff, especially with soybeans. And these were the sort of unintended consequences of the last round of tariff that a Trump administration put in place. They put tariffs on soybeans, and the Chinese, Brazil diverted their exports to China. So Brazil has some quite resiliency. Their main trade part. It's very, very divided, almost equally between Asia, North America, and Europe. So they have the ability to substitute. Now, there's certain things they can't substitute because there's not only direct trade with the United States, but it looks like NATO is going to come in with as well because Brazil is trading with the Soviet Union, or sorry, Russia, excuse me. That's kind of acts like the Soviet Union these days. And that's subject to trade retaliation from NATO, and we'll have to see what happens there. So the ability for Brazil to diversify is being hindered a bit, mainly because of their political stance, their foreign policy stance. And Brazil has historically, one of the very best foreign policy ministry in the world. They used to do it very quietly, silently, behind the scenes, and the people that work there are all of excellent caliber. However, some of the things we've seen lately are certainly hurting Brazil in the views of the world, especially with a number of stances they've taken recently. So the economics is tough. It's hard to say exactly what sectors in Brazil are going to be hit. Certainly, Sueli brought up coffee. 80% of our coffee that we consume in the United States actually comes from Brazil. It's the exact Arabiat, same thing as Colombian. You have a number of, in the automobile sector, you have had full integration like with Mexico, but you do have some integration there. There's airplanes, and some of the airplanes have gotten a carve out. So from Embraer, we're getting all these carve outs, which also makes things more complicated. To give you an idea, okay, these are really, I would say, not so great bilateral trade deals that we're getting. The reason is the inefficiency of it is amazing. We talked about Brazil being able to substitute. That's called trade diversion. That means Brazil is going to be importing stuff at a higher cost than they are right now. And so that has a cost. It's not a complete cost, like going back to autarky, you get some substitution. But it is a cost. And just think of these my view, the bilateral kind of negotiation ploy is not very good. It's very inefficient. We knew that after the collapse of world trade, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and creating the GATT. But I calculate, let's say we have a country that trades with 20 different countries. And you want to you create a bilateral trade agreement, not even to go into the number of goods that are done. With each one, you get 1,814,400 different possibilities in terms of the outcome. Then you add in the different categories of goods. It becomes just a nightmare of negotiation. I would like if Stephen, if you would comment on that. But I think it's incredibly inefficient to negotiate this way. It works okay in real estate and stuff like that, but in trade it does not work. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Sweetie.
Thank you. Steve, if you want to add anything from John's comments. If not, I want to ask a very practical question that came from one of our attendees. Okay? What potential pathways or negotiation strategies do you see for Brazil and the United States to de-escalate these trade tensions and work toward a more stable trade relationship between our countries?
Well, one, I don't believe in panicking. I don't believe that you have to run up and wait till before August 7th when the duties and everything's supposed to go in effect. I don't see that. I mean, etc. It shows weakness. I don't think Lulu's going to show that weakness anyway. If you read the executive order that they put in, they spend more time talking about the particular justice who the U.S. thinks is unfair, and the language that some people use to describe Mr. Trump, they used to describe Brazil and so on, etc. But as far as criminal behavior, respect for human rights, etc., etc. And I don't see that. And then you pointed out earlier, or we had discussed earlier, the fact that Rubio had a meeting with the foreign minister. Was that discussed or not? I'm sure it was. Did anything come out? Did anybody come up with a pathway or a way to move ahead? I don't know yet. But that's on that issue. But that issue had to somehow be dealt with before you can deal with the trade issue. And so on, because I don't see how you can move ahead on one without the other, given the fact that they're linked in the Federal Register order that implements this agreement. So, and that, I like to say, is beyond my pay grade. So I don't know what will happen with that one, and so on. I do notice, however, that Mr. Trump doesn't mind arguing and then making an agreement. Look what he did with China and so on. We pretty well defined China with 30% duties and so on, etc. And a chance that will go down because some of those duties are because of alleged lack of cooperation in immigration, fentanyl trade, things like that. And again, they're discussing that issue and so on. So that might even go down somewhat. So my feeling is that cool it.
I was just going to echo many of the things that Mr. Landa said. I think there's two things that there's Brazil's trajectory forward. What should they do and what will they do? What I think they should do, the hell will freeze over before they do it, as Mr. Landa said a little differently. But the best thing for them to do is first be quiet. As you said, step back. And second, Brazil's still very protectionist. The effective rate of protection on automobiles is 73%, last time I looked. So they should look to open unilaterally. Now, we're not going to get that, but they should open up to everybody, not negotiate bilaterals and things like that. Second, there's three things that the U.S. was hammering on throughout the last 40 years, and this so-called trips and trims. And this is where Mexico comes in. And a good way to remember the USMCA, Stephen, is remember Gomer Pyle. So that's how I remember. So anyway, is to Brazil has improved its intellectual property rights protection. It has improved trade and services. It has improved the investment parts of trade, but it still isn't at the level that Mexico has, which they had to sign on to because of the NAFTA, and they were big beneficiaries, especially from China in this respect. That would be a way to first be quiet, back channel, as Mr. Landis said, and as well, Luis. Brazil is very good at that, and then just start doing these things on the side. Finally, there's a question of constitutionality. What can the state of Florida do? There's a number of questions about, lobbying and things like, yeah, if you want carve-outs, I'm not really good at that, but we've had like 50,000 carve-outs on these other deals. But it's still a question of whether these tariffs and trade restrictions are constitutional. And now we're in the first appeal court. And from my looking at the comments of the judges, they think it's not. Trade comes under Congress. It doesn't come under the executive. So there's still that part there. What can Florida do within their own constitution? Well, the Florida was very creative in terms of police support and things like that. He said, anyone that wants to leave some of these high crime cities, come down to Florida, we'll give you a bonus. Now, there's a couple of ways that they can do this. And you can do this bilaterally, I guess, with Brazil or with a number of other countries, but it has to go within the jurisdiction of the state. The problem is again, trade issues are with U.S. Congress, and it's a blanket for the country. But there can be other things, some kind of drawback system, something only the ports, and you're in Tampa, which is really important. Also, we have Jacksonville here. There's a number of ways to do that bilaterally, quietly, where you can help the Brazilian businesses here that rely on Brazil, Brazilian businesses that rely on Florida to move forward. But they're a little bit constrained of what they can do because of the constitutionality of this. So let me start. I'm optimistic as well, Mr. Landis. I think we've seen these sort of gyrations before. The problem is the people that are negotiating these trades are mercantilist by nature. Exports good, imports bad, which is, if anyone has a cell phone knows that not imports are good too. So the idea here is to increase trade both ways as much as possible.
Thank you, John. I'm sorry, Stephen, but we've been getting dozens of questions via chat here. But before you present your closing remarks, I have one here because you are very involved with the NAFTA creation. There is a question here direct to you. Drawing on your role in shaping NAFTA, what unique challenges do the current U.S. tariffs on Brazil present compared to other trade disputes you have encountered? And what lessons from those negotiations could inform a more constructive approach to resolving our current situation between Brazil and the USA?
I also noticed there's a number of questions in the chat box.
Yes.
That, again, I see time short, so I don't know how to deal with that and so on. But let me respond in a second. This is unique. In my day and age, you would have a trade problem. You would say you're violating the WTO, you're violating even the GATT. You would then bring a dispute settlement mechanism. Usually the sides wanted to come to an agreement within that rule. They would either negotiate a solution or a country would have a right to retaliate, meaning take action against the other country and so on. This is not on the table now. It's off the table. So when you keep looking for precedents, they don't exist. This administration has yet not indicated what it thinks about free trade agreements. It has a proposal by Kenya and the UK, among others, to immediately enter into negotiations for a free trade agreement. It makes a lot of sense because generally, if other countries have higher duties than the US has, when you go into an FTA, you end up at zero. So you go down and so on. And if the US makes that claim, the difference is that the US then has to open the market up for the other country. Maybe it's better, maybe this group feels it's better off to just push for unilateral concessions and not open up to other countries. Again, has to be decisions made by the administration. So when you ask for past presidents, I can't help you. I can only argue like I have with my State Department background, like you said, back channel, quiet discussions. I can't find, I'm looking for it and I'm somewhat embarrassed, but there's this national trade estimate that is published. Just look it up, NTE, National Trade Estimate every year. In Brazil, I had 5 pages on it when I looked it up. And I immediately said to myself, if I was a negotiator, I look at these 5 pages and say, here's 3 things I could do. And I was going to be really smart and read them and say, here are some things you can do. But I can't do that on a document. But if you look at it, or maybe John knows what's in there, maybe there are 2 or 3 things in the areas that you have described where something can be done. And it should be done in the interest of Brazil, not necessarily for the US, but it should have a positive impact on the US. So that's a step you can take and then see what you get back. That's how they did it with China. They began limiting, they had an export restriction list, and then they would begin liberalizing it a little bit, particularly in semiconductors. Then China would do something. So the rhetoric ended up at the high level, not as high. Chinese did not use the language we used, but it ended at a high level. But nevertheless, they got to the point where all of a sudden Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, went out and said, boy, we're taking these 130% duties and bringing them first down to 10. I think they reverted back up to about 30 now. And then if we make problem on fentanyl, we make progress on immigration, like I said, those duties can even go back down again and so on. So that's how you solve problems and so on. So that's kind of my reaction to what you said. Looking at the Q's and A's, I'm only going to respond to 2 very quickly. Is that, again, my understanding is that Brazil has not decided whether it's going to retaliate or not. So for the question is, are the Brazilians going to put a 50% duty on the other products? Yes, that is kind of unknown, is to put it mildly, and it is kind of be a big difference and so on, etc. Uh, I don't think the actions, unfortunately, are for public. I mean, I think the actions are tied up with this tariff approach of the US, but I don't know the solution to the political side of this issue. I've never had a problem like that. When we had our very heavy negotiations with Japan, again back in the 70s and 80s and so on, etc., 90s, we always had one rule. Remember, Japan is our unsinkable aircraft carrier, is our unsinkable ally in that part of the world. So when you negotiate, do nothing to get into the political field and don't start criticizing them or not. Use your trade pressure, which we had a lot of because we bought a lot of Japanese products and so on. Use your trade pressure to get things done. I don't know again and so on. So I really leave this political issue that you should have. Actually, your next speaker should be somebody who can speak on the political issue, and you can see what you can play with that. So that's kind of my response and so on, etc.
Any other questions from the chat? Would you like to respond, Stephen?
No, I think, well, I can go through them quickly. I thought some of them were more in John's area than mine, like what can small business do in order, if you're tied into US trade, it doesn't do you any good to know that you can sell the product some other place because your business depends on what you're doing with the US. And again, I don't know what's available in Brazil to help small business. Remember that when the US retaliated against China, and then China retaliated against the US in agriculture, Mr. Trump then went and got himself a big budget allocation from Congress that he used to pay off the agricultural community and so on. So I come back and say, I don't know what you can do on the state level. I don't know if this administration, I don't think the administration feels a need, particularly with its own budgetary problem, to do something there. But that's a hard issue, and I don't have an answer for that one. I think John is raising his hand, so he might have a response on that.
Sorry, I was giving a pen to my son. But you're absolutely right. I think there's many things that Brazil can do to help itself that can help ameliorate the situation. The big loser in all this is the United States, of course. And it sort of reminds me of that scene in Die Hard, where Mel Gibson takes himself as hostage and threatens to shoot himself in the head if somebody doesn't do anything. The worst thing to do is then say, okay, no, I'm going to shoot me in the head if you don't stop doing that, myself, Brazil has many places where they could, and they have to think, like you very much, the president of Mexico emphasized, Sheinbaum did a very good job of sitting down and thinking, what do they really want? They wanted immigration, I think, was at least the beginning. And they were already going to do this huge immigration border thing, but they announced, okay, we're putting all these extra people on the border, and that was a great PR. And so Brazil has to think very carefully about exactly what the administration wants from the trade protection. If it's economic, which is why I'm only going to talk about that, I think a unilateral opening is the best thing that Brazil can do. But I don't think this government has any predilections towards that at all.
I think it was in too, but I'm watching the time. There's a question in the chat box about BRICS. And the way I explain BRICS to my people are there are hard issues and soft issues in BRICS. There's an Indian position, which is keeping half an eye on the US, so they're not leading the battle on currency reform and so on, etc. They're not leading, South Africa with military cooperation. They are doing what they think is necessary, and particularly taking advantage of the economic opportunity that Russia offers them in terms of either purchasing things for lower prices, petroleum, in terms of selling. So it's that kind of an issue. It's not do you stay in the BRICS or not, is what do you associate with your BRIC positions and so on, etc. And the US is very sensitive to the currency issues. I'm not sure that Brazil has that much power in the currency area. So I don't know if they were able to, whether they should be even in that debate. So sometimes you have to say to yourself, one thing that always annoys me, and I never quite understand it, is that every year there's a vote in the UN on Cuba. And obviously, there were some questions about unilateral US embargo in Cuba, but it doesn't affect anybody. Yet every country will line up and will vote with Cuba on the issue, except Israel and one or two other countries like in Central America sometimes. So, etc. I was saying to myself, why? It's not of immediate interest to you. You know there's somebody in the US who checks off that particular box. What are you voting on that issue for? You're not changing the situation. You're not having any impact on US-Cuban relations. So what I always say to my people is, yes, we're not asking you to give up your positions, but emphasize those positions that are extremely important to you. And those that aren't there, if you happen to be on the other side from the US, don't feel you have to take a leadership position on that particular issue and so on. So anyway, that's my response on BRICS. That it isn't whether you're part of BRICS, is what issues within BRICS you support and so on. And that gets you down to, again, an issue that, as you said, intermarriage is expert enough that I'm sure they know how to balance it without any help from any of us. So I think we're there. Other than that, I assume we're coming close to the end anyway, but I really appreciated the opportunity. The questions that were asked were excellent. I'm sorry we're not able to go through all the answers in the chat box, but I'll be more than happy to stay in contact with Sue Lee, and if there's any follow-up, be available, in terms of communication. And I really look forward to meeting with John Welsh because how do I put it, and so on, etc. When you've been in trade as long as I've been and you see a new face, you say, great, because I'm tired of seeing the same faces, for my whole career, and they're still there and so on, but less influential than they used to be. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to meet John, hear his views, and maybe we might be able to collaborate on some initiatives that fall into our possibility. And I think the best thing out of this conversation is figure out what Lula wants to do in his own interest of his country. Again, trade liberalization would be nice, but who knows? And then see if we can help identify those issues and then develop some kind of a strategy for getting that issue on the table and begin to build little bridges so we can end up with superhighways. And that's the way I think I'd leave it. And I thank you so much for the opportunity, Sue Lee.